Okay, so now we'll be going over lecture six, lecture six, which will cover sexuality, partnership, and marriage. Okay. So in this lecture, we'll be discussing different sexual identities and sexuality. We'll also discuss queer families and their dynamics. We'll also cover patterns of sexual activity in relationships and out of relationships. And finally, we'll conclude by discussing teen pregnancy rates and family outcomes for teen parents and their children. Okay. So first, let's talk about sexual identities and the research on sexual identities. So in 1948, a zoologist named Alfred Kinsey explored men's sexual behaviors. In his study, he interviewed thousands of men and found that about half of the men in his sample reported having erotic feelings towards other men, and a third of the men reported having at least one sexual experience with another man. Kinsey concluded that sexuality has a spectrum rather than a dichotomy of being heterosexual or homosexual. So rather, it's a spectrum of sexual identities or sexual feelings, I should say. Before this, people would often think in terms of being heterosexual and or homosexual, but the Kinsey report shed light on the wide range of sexual expressions and identities one could potentially have. So, the social constructionist perspective on sexuality would argue that sexual identities are entirely socially created. To support this perspective, theorists point to unclear boundaries of two genders in heterosexuality. They argue that history has found many different variations of sexual expression and gender expression as well, and the names and ways sexuality has been expressed change throughout history. Sorry, I don't know. I think I should be, sorry if you couldn't see me before. I'm putting my screen on this side. As a result, social constructionists argue that today's sexual identities vary from culture to culture. In a recent study, specifically the National Survey of Family Growth, they asked people across the United States about their sexual preferences and identities and found that many people report having same-sex attraction, but won't report or consider themselves to be gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Rather, they consider themselves straight but have more fluid attractions, but they identify as straight. This goes back to the conclusion made in the Kinsey report, which argued that sexuality is fluid, but sexual identity can vary from person to person based on their cultural or social beliefs. All right. The integrative perspective on human sexuality argues that sexuality is influenced by both social and biological factors. So social construction of sexual identities is important, but sexual nature is the tendency to be attracted to partners of the opposite or the same sex. Oftentimes, sociologists will use twin studies and genome-wide association studies to support this perspective. So in one study, researchers found that among identical twins, which they often use to support their perspective, that there is a potential for sexual orientation to be linked to genetics. However, no study has conclusively linked sexual attraction to genes. Rather, it may be influenced by both biological and cultural factors. But the key thing to note, and this will come up on your test, is that for the integrative perspective, they'll use twin studies, which are a bit more, I guess you could say, robust. And they'll also use genome-wide associations, but they typically like to use twin studies because the genetics that twins share are incredibly similar. So they like to use those to understand the biological perspective. Okay. So now let's talk about LGBTQ families and what it means to be a family. So LGBTQ individuals may experience rejection from their own families of origin because of their sexual identities. When they are rejected by their families, oftentimes they will develop what's called chosen families. And we kind of talked about this in lecture one. We went over public and private families. Oftentimes, though, these families are formed through voluntary ties among individuals who are not biologically or legally related. Chosen families, again, are very similar to voluntary kinship ties. Their chosen family is often made up of close friends or other people in the LGBTQ community. Chosen families are more common among middle-class LGBTQ individuals, and a potential reason for this is that maintaining large friendship networks often takes a lot of time and money, like paying for social outings, organizing trips with friends, and going to parties. So you would need more access to resources or access to funds to be able to maintain a chosen family. As a result, lower income LGBTQ individuals may have a harder time maintaining a sense of community if their family of origin does end up rejecting them. When asked who makes up their family, LGBTQ individuals are likely to mention both chosen family members and biological kin, but who is prioritized or mentioned more often depends on the level of acceptance the family of origin provides. Okay. So let's talk about how LGBTQ families divide up household chores, how they become parents, and just the day-to-day of being a family. So there are a few different ways that LGBTQ couples can become parents. One way is for a person to have a child in a heterosexual relationship, and that relationship come out and then retain custody of the child. This type of family or this type of family building is declining as people are coming out sooner, which leads to fewer LGBTQ individuals entering into heterosexual relationships. We'd often find this with couples that they would get married, and maybe someone was closeted for a really long time, or they didn't realize that they had same-sex attraction or identified as that, and then later down the road after they had children, realized later on that they were part of the LGBTQ community, or they came out, and that's how that typically happens. But again, that isn't seen as often today. LGBTQ couples are more likely to become parents through assisted reproductive technology, either through donor insemination, a surrogate, or IVF. Some parents will also choose to adopt a child, often a child in foster care, because children in foster care are more likely to be placed with same-sex couples, just because there are less people seeking to adopt children in foster care. Typically, when we look at heterosexual couples or straight couples, they're looking to adopt young children, and specifically children, through private adoption agencies, while same-sex couples are open to taking on more challenging cases that could be in the foster care system. So they're more likely to adopt older children or be open to adopting older children. And they don't necessarily limit themselves to just a young child. Although the research on LGBTQ families and child outcomes is limited, the research does suggest that children living with same-sex parents do not differ from children living with opposite sex parents. More current research has found that children raised by same-sex parents may actually do better because same-sex parents who have children tend to be more financially stable, because they often have to save money for reproductive assisted technology. So they have to save money for the sperm donor, a surrogate, or IVF, or they have to save money for adoption. So they tend to be a little bit more financially stable, and they're often more accepting of their child and their interests. When studying same-sex couples and the division of labor in the home, we find that chores are split more evenly between partners. Although the division of labor is more equal, it doesn't always mean a 50-50 split. All of the time, sometimes partners will take on more care work, while the other partner will take on more labor work, like going to work more or working longer hours, while the other one will stay home and do more household care or childcare. One partner taking on more household labor may be due to also time availability, earning power, or preferences. So they may divide household chores based off which partner feels more comfortable or does one chore particularly well, or they have more time to handle that chore, or one partner might make significantly more, but it does require them to be out of the house, so the other one will take on more care work. Overall, though, the labor is not divided by perceived gender roles. It's just based off, again, time availability, earning power, and preferences. Now we're going to move on to sexual activity, specifically people's sexual lives in relationships and also out of relationships. So people's sexual lives and activities are going to be influenced by cultural norms, in particular the increasing acceptability of sex outside of marriage and the increased access to contraception. Before the 1960s, sexual attraction and romantic love were only encouraged in the confines of marriage. Although romantic love was considered an important part of a relationship, many couples would wait until they were married to have sex. However, in the 1960s, sexual expression and gratification became really valued in relationships, and sexual activity outside of marriage became a little bit more common. The changing views on the purpose of sex may be due to the increase in individualism, the access to the birth control pill, and people needing to postpone marriage to pursue education or careers. Today, about 90% of unmarried women report having sex, and this trend is likely to continue. Extramarital sex, which is sexual activity by a married person or someone in a married a relationship too, I guess it could include, with someone other than their spouse, is not considered the norm in our culture. It's actually kind of frowned upon. Rather, most long-term relationships are monogamous, which is when a married or committed partners only have a sexual relationship with their spouse or long-term partner. They don't typically go to anyone else other than their long-term partner. That's kind of the norm. Monogamy is the norm, and most couples do expect monogamy. There are some people who have polyamorous relationships where they might have multiple partners, but on average, most couples are monogamous. Although most people believe that having sex outside of marriage is fine, so having sex before you're married is fine, most people also think it's morally wrong to have an extramarital affair or to cheat on your partner, whether you're married to them or not. People in cohabitating relationships typically maintain monogamous relationships as well, despite not being legally bound to their partner. As a result, individuals who have a series of committed relationships typically follow a pattern known as serial monogamy, which is the succession of monogamous sexual relationships. So this is pretty common nowadays, where people will kind of not necessarily marry, but they will enter relationships and have sexual experiences, but also remain monogamous to their partners. Okay. Sexual activity outside of a committed relationship is also very common. These are typically known as hookups. Hookups are defined as sexual encounters with no expectation of further involvement. However, what occurs during a hookup or how one defines a hookup can vary from person to person. So for the most part, though, hookups do not require romantic attraction or a desire for a relationship. Hookups are most likely to occur in a group setting like a party or at a bar, and they typically involve alcohol to a certain extent. With the rise of dating apps, hookups are also occurring more often through these online channels as well, like Tinder. I don't really know. I've been married for a while, so I know Tinder is one of them. Maybe Bumble? I don't know. So yeah, so online platforms are increasing the amount of hookups or the ways that you can set up a hookup. There are some pros and cons to hookups. Some benefits of hookups include being able to engage in sexual activity without having to enter into a long-term relationship. And this is great for young adults, since many young adults are in their sexual prime, especially in their early 20s, but are waiting to marry later in life. So young adults use hookups as a way to engage in sex without worrying about long-term implications of the relationship. It's also a way to explore sexual behaviors or sexual interests. Some say that it can boost self-esteem as well. However, there are some downsides to hookup culture, and one of those is going to be the sexual double standard, which tends to favor men. So what we'll find is that it's more socially acceptable for men to have multiple sexual partners, while it's more frowned upon for women to have multiple sexual partners. If you think about the terms that are used when we think about men and women who are sexually active or have multiple sexual partners with men, sometimes they're considered players, or they're considered to have game, or, you know, they must have so many partners because they're so attractive or they're so successful. Um, and when we think about women who have a lot of sexual partners, a lot of the time terms like slut or whore or things like that, and excuse my language for that, will be used to describe those women. But for men, more positive terms are associated, while with women, more negative terms are associated with this. Um, and in that article that's assigned for this week, they'll talk about that a little bit more. It's really interesting. So pay attention to that section because it's really interesting what men and women have to say about the number of sexual partners you have. And then another downside is the ambiguity of the relationship of the hookup. So um, sometimes people report feeling confused after hooking up with someone or not understanding the status of their relationship. So as we know, hookups aren't limited to one night stands. They also might include, regular hookups like a friends with benefits situation, or more common term today could be a situationship, um, where you're hooking up with someone regularly, but it's kind of you're not sure exactly what the relationship is. So that can be a downside. They also talk about that again in that article that is assigned to you this week. All right. So now we're going to move on to teen pregnancy. So with increased access to birth control and sex education, adolescent sexual activity has risen since the 1960s, but it's also slowly been declining in more recent years. The reason for this decline is a bit foggy. Some researchers believe that since there is a decline in teen marriages, that there is a decline in teen marriages, so teenagers getting married to other teenagers, this may lead to a decline in sexual activity. I think that explanation is a little bit weird, but I also don't have a better explanation, so I don't know. Um, but it is interesting. So sexual activity among teens has risen, but it's also recently been kind of like leveling off and declining over recent years. What is really interesting, though, is that boys are more likely to report having had sex more often than girls. So, for example, 44% of adolescent boys report having engaged in sexual activity, while only 42% of girls report having ever had sex. How, but this is only a small discrepancy in the past. There's been a larger discrepancy in the reporting, and some of this might be due to, again, that sexual double standard where it's okay for men and young boys, or young teenage boys, I should say, to admit to having sexual experiences, while for young women or young teen girls, it might not be as acceptable for them to talk about their sexual experiences. So that might be the discrepancy. Okay. So the number of teen births has been declining over the past several years. It's actually at an all-time low right now. Again, this can be linked to access to birth control and access to sexual education. The rates of teen pregnancy do vary by state. So in states where abstinence-only education is the only form of sex education students get, there is a higher rate of teen pregnancy. And then in schools that take on a more all-encompassing approach to sex education, they have less teen pregnancy rates. And again, what contributes to the birth rate, increased sexual activity among unmarried teens, also their understanding and education surrounding sex. So what it means, what it looks like, how people get pregnant is also a big question mark for some teens, and how to avoid pregnancy. I can kind of speak to this. So when I was doing my research on teen pregnancy, I found that a lot of the teen moms I was talking to, they didn't know what sex was. No one talked to them about sex in their at school or in their families. So when I would ask them, like, what kind of sex education did you get? They said, I got none. I said, did your parents talk to you about sex? No, they just told me not to do it. I actually interviewed a 13-year-old when I asked her this question. Well, she wasn't 13. She was 13 when she got pregnant, 18 when I interviewed her. And so when I asked her, I was like, hey, like, did your family ever talk to you about this? She said, no. I actually didn't know what sex was. I was 13. No one told me what it was. I had no idea what was going on. She's like, at that point, I just thought people went under the covers. I didn't know what happened. Like in movies, you know, they go under the covers. She's like, I didn't know what happened under the covers. And so when I asked her, I was like, so how did you get pregnant? She said, me and her 13-year-old boyfriend at the time just kind of did what felt right or felt good. And that's how they had sex and got married. So, or got pregnant. They didn't get married, but they got pregnant. So a lot of times there is increased sexual activity among teens, but also there is a lack of knowledge about how to prevent pregnancy, what sex even is, or how people get pregnant and what that means. So those could be contributing to the birth rate. Okay. So there are there's lots of research about what goes wrong after a teen gets pregnant and becomes a parent. So what the research says is they're less likely to complete high school or get a college degree. And as a result, they tend to have lower paying jobs. So they tend to be low income families or be single parent low income families. They're more likely to rely on public assistance and welfare. They're more likely to report high levels of depression and anxiety, and they're less likely to have stable romantic relationships. Again, a lot of this can be linked back to not completing high school or being able to get a college degree. And the reason that I got into this research and the thing that I'm really passionate about when it comes to understanding teen pregnancy and teen parents and their experiences is that a lot of the research we have on teen parents tends to take a deficit approach. So when we look at the research on teen parents, they're like, these are all the things that are going wrong. Can you believe this? They're never gonna, nothing good is ever gonna happen to these teen moms. It's awful. There's not a lot of approach. And again, there's a lot of blame put onto a young teenager who got pregnant. But what we don't pay attention to is their social support systems, who's helping them through that, who's teaching them, you know, what resources are available to you. How can we balance, you know, your life as a teenager, but also your new life as a parent? An example of this was, to kind of put it into context, is so we have this statistic that teen parents are less likely, specifically teen mothers, are less likely to complete high school. And some people write that off as, oh, they're just lazy, or oh, they couldn't handle it. I interviewed again that teen mother who was 13 when she got pregnant. She was in middle school. And when I talked to her, you know, what was school like after you got pregnant? What happened was she was getting bullied by not only her peers, but she was being discouraged by her teachers. She could hear them whispering about her, talking bad about her. And it got to a point where she got pulled into her principal's office and they asked her, or they told her, you're no longer welcome to come to school. You're basically on a suspension. She asked why. And she's like, well, your pregnant body is a distraction. And she's like, well, I'm getting bullied. I'm doing this. They're like, well, you just have to leave school. We'll get you, you'll have to do independent study. So she went on independent study through most of her 8th grade year while she was pregnant. So yeah, when she hit that second trimester, she had to finish 8th grade year at home. And that was really hard for her because she was relying on people, specifically the school, to provide her the material she needed to succeed in school. And then she was figuring out a lot of her lessons at home. She didn't get these nice lecture videos or anything like that. She just got worksheets and was expected to figure it out. And then two, sometimes she said that they wouldn't give her the worksheets or the materials she needed to do for that week on time. So she would be doing tons of coursework just trying to graduate. And that continued on into high school. Her, not necessarily the independent study, but having to really advocate for herself and say, no, these are the materials I need, and balancing, you know, having a newborn with doing homework. And that was a really frustrating process for it. And one thing that really stood out to me is that she was expected to do all the childcare work. and manage, going to high school and getting an education, and then also working to provide her child. But then when I asked her, what was expected of the child's father, who was also the same age as her at the time, he didn't have to do any of that. No one told him to do that, or no one was expecting the same level of care he had to provide. So again, it might not be that there's this lack of drive, which sometimes the research points to, or, a lack of desire to do well. It's just there isn't a lot of support. So yeah, we're going to learn more about that when in your teen pregnancy discussion board. Um, so yeah, we'll cover that. It's really interesting stuff. And if you have any questions, I love to talk about this kind of thing. So yeah, all right. So we're going to wrap up this lecture with talking about sexuality and family life. So again, we started in 1948 with the Kinsey report that found that sexuality is a spectrum, sexual expression is a spectrum, and there's different ideas about sexual identity, how it's defined. And there is, the social constructivist view versus the integrative perspective. In the 1960s and 70s, we saw a shift in more progressive attitudes towards sex. There was an increase in sexual gratification, which led to increases in sex outside of marriage. And that also increased due to access to the birth control pill and other contraception methods. Today, a lot of the understanding of sexual activity, attraction, and orientation has really expanded, especially as we understand LGBTQ families as premarital or non-marital sex, I should say, increases, as single parent families increase, or cohabitating couples become more common. But overall, our understanding of sexuality and what that means in families and relationships has really expanded. So yeah, that's kind of our wrap up for this lecture. So there we have it.